Hey, thanks so much for listening to the Ridge Community Church podcast. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors on staff at the Ridge, and our vision is to bring the hope of Jesus into every home. So as a piece of that, our goal each week is to bring you something that's hopeful and helpful. So subscribe to this podcast to make sure you don't miss any hopeful and helpful conversations. Hey everyone, and thanks for listening to this episode of the Ridge Community Church podcast. If you find today's episode hopeful and helpful, then please follow or subscribe and then rate and review so that more people can find the conversation. I have a little bit of a more unique topic for you this week because it's not really a conversation unless it's, I guess, talking with myself. So we're in the middle of this series called The Most Important Thing. And it's really about how the most important thing statistically to grow your faith is regularly reading the Bible. And so throughout this series, we've been talking about, hey, why is this so important? Why does it matter? Why does it grow your faith? Maybe a little bit of brief background on some Bible elements, and then, some practical things for how you can dive in and actually do some reading of the Bible. And if you haven't caught any of that, I would encourage you to head over to our YouTube channel, or you can even catch up on some previous episodes of the podcast, but that's going to be really valuable for you as well. Now, as part of this series, one of the cool things that I've had the benefit of in my life is as training and the ability to study in seminary is in a Bible school, and actually got my master's there. And so it kind of offers a unique opportunity to talk about some of the things that I've learned about the Bible, and I've learned about reading the Bible and why it's made such an impact for me, and just be able to bring some of those things to all of you that are listening. And so for our conversation today is really just me sharing some of the things that have really made an impact on me and how I read the Bible, and some of my big takeaways from seminary, and kind of the 3 years that I spent, studying different books of the Bible, studying how to read the Bible, studying Greek and Hebrew, and my takeaways, and hopefully that these things will be helpful for you as you read the Bible and kind of put some of these things into practice. So what I want to do is share some of my big takeaways, and then maybe a little bit about how practically that might apply to how you would read the Bible or how you'd understand the Bible. So let's get to it. Maybe I'll start with some of just like the brief things that I learned, not necessarily just in seminary, right? But so overall holistic look at the Bible is you're looking at not one big book, but 66 collections of writings, right? And some of these are historical pieces, some of these are poems, some of these are songs, some of these are wise sayings, some of them are really biographies about like the life of Jesus. Some of these are letters written to churches, some of these are letters written to individuals. And so you have these 66 books, and they're all put together really in this library. And so once you realize that, it kind of changes a little bit about how you read the Bible, because it makes the importance of context so much clearer. In one of my first days in seminary, the professor was sharing that the rules about reading the Bible are very similar to the rules of real estate, which are, the rule of real estate is location, location, location. And the big part of reading the Bible is context, context, context. And what he meant by that is that there's so much that goes into each portion of the Bible and understanding it. And I think one of the cool ways to illustrate this is that you wouldn't read like a history book the same way that you would read a text message from a friend, right? So somebody says something as a text message, or somebody writes you a heartfelt letter or a thank you note. You're going to read and interpret what is meant by that, and how to kind of go about that differently than you would, you're scrolling on Wikipedia and you're gathering some information on there. They're just written differently for a different audience and for a different purpose. I mean, same way you could even look at like a movie, right? Like you're going to read that different, or watch that and engage with that differently than you would something that is like historical, or even like you get the point. And so with those elements, I get, okay, so I know I'm going to read it differently. How does that change kind of how I'm going to read and interpret things? Well, it means that when you get a different understanding of a piece, it just really, it gives you a bigger richness to what it really means. And what I mean by that, like, I think a great example is, Jesus interacting with the tax collector is something that, we just hear in a phrase, and it carries with it a weight of, okay, so a tax collector, maybe you think IRS, and you're like, okay, well, people don't necessarily like the IRS because they give them money. Well, Jesus interacting with a tax collector and loving him is a different scale than that, because contextually, like knowing the time period that something was written in would change how you'd interpret it, right? So a tax collector in Jesus' time was somebody who would take advantage of people, very regularly was made wealthy based off of cheating people out of their money, because in the context that they were in the Roman government, they're working for their oppressors. So strike one. And two, they are charging people more than the Roman government would require them to charge. And so it's costing them more money, right? And so when you see Jesus have compassion or invite this tax collector into their life, you're reading it differently. Now, how you would expand on this, like on a practical level, is when you start to see the compassion, and it just kind of reveals more of God's character when you have that greater richness, right? So that changes it from being, like a normal person just trying to do their job, and it just happens to be an unfortunate and unpopular person, to somebody that has a history of cheating and hurting others. And that just illustrates a little bit more of God's character that you can kind of reflect on and grow for yourself in, right? Other contextual elements that are really important go beyond understanding, hey, who is this written to? What was the location? What was the culture? All of those things matter and reveal a richness, but also looking in the context of how you can apply a certain verse or get encouragement from a certain verse. A great example that I like to use with this one, and that was taught to me, comes from the book of Philippians. And in the first, in Philippians 1, I'll just read 1, 5, and 6. And what we're looking for here, as I kind of read it, is thinking, okay, contextually, how do these things fit into the grander like narrative that is being written to around it, and in the whole book that's being written? Because it may be interpreted by our like current knowledge in one way, but really like the context of the passage dictates that we would kind of read it in a little bit of a different way and maybe be encouraged or apply something a little bit different. So Philippians 1, 5, and 6 says, because of your partnership in the gospel from the first days until now, being confident of this, that he who began a good work in you will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. And so maybe you read that and it's like, okay, when you partner with God, you like that work gets continued until it's completed. So it's like the ripple effects of your work is done. And that is totally true, right? That's something that's accurate, right? So how the context might change just a little bit is that through in the bookends of Philippians, at the very end of the passage, in chapter 4, he's talking about that partnership was how they supported him financially. And so it changes it a little bit, because then you're reading the context of the first verse and you're saying, hey, because of your giving, because of the way that you supported me in the gospel from the first days and now, be confident that that good work is going to continue to revolve in completion until the days of Christ Jesus, right? So it's like, okay, so your giving will have an effect. The ripple effects of that will be beyond what you can imagine. Just be sure that work will be completed and will be good. And that's a different encouragement, right? Because I do believe that the first concept is true, where the works that you are doing and the partnership you give with God, those things will be completed as well. But this is very clearly this is an element of talking about finances and how the gifts that you give, don't worry, God is going to use them and make that good work matter. And so the point I use to illustrate this is to say, hey, when you read a full passage, when you have a full context of a passage, it can change how you interpret. And maybe that changes a little bit about how you apply the things that you're reading. And, the whole point of reading the Bible is, yes, to grow in connection with God. Yes, to go closer to him and understand his story better, but also to give an understanding of, hey, what things can I apply in my life? What knowledge do I now have that changes my perception of God? What behaviors can I really alter to make the most out of my relationship with God and to love other people well? And so the context can provide some of that. Now, I realize that this is like an easy thing for me to say going through, I spent 3 years studying these elements and say, okay, just have the context for it. And I realize that's differently depending on schedules and time and all those things and what they look like. But my hope would be that as you dive into it, maybe an encouragement I would give you is just to go slow. As you're reading through a passage, as you're deciding, okay, I'm going to read this book of the Bible, take a little bit of time and gain some context for what it is, and that's going to color and probably give you a better richness for what it is, right? So, for example, if you're reading a letter from Paul to a church, well, knowing a little bit about that church is going to help you, right? So it's like you're reading this letter from this person. So, hey, who is this person? I'd like to know a little bit about Paul before I read what he's writing to somebody. And I'd like to know a little bit about the context that it's happening in, right? So you want to know the context for the story and the information. You want to gain that information before you overhear the conversation, essentially, to really be able to fully get the most out of it. And I think kind of understand the richness that's there and present. Great ways to do this. If you want to go really in depth, you can read up on the book. You can purchase whole books on certain books. You can do that. There's lots of great YouTube videos like the Bible Project and things like that are going to give you a kind of an overview of like the context of a certain book. And so, and usually they're like less than 10 minutes. And so it's like, okay, if you're going to spend, say you're going to read a chapter a day, and you're going to be spending like a week or more in a certain book. What's 10 minutes, right? Watch before you start it, watch that video, get that little bit of information, put that in your back pocket. And then as you're reading, you can like kind of see some of it playing out, and read it in that way. Because I think one of the temptations that I found with reading the Bible is you read it and you just interpret it kind of through your kind of, oh, what is this like saying to me currently? Like it's being written to you. And while that's true in terms of like, yes, it is written in regards for you so that you can grow in your connection with God, it's also something that it was also written for a specific group of people at a specific time. And so understanding that is really helpful. You can also, like a good study Bible will have information typically at the beginning of a book, kind of giving, hey, this is the time period that this is written. This is the location. These are some key factors and some key things about the book to read on. And those are all just really helpful as you kind of gain your understanding and your knowledge of a book. So changing a little bit of gears outside of context for a second here. My favorite class in seminary was when I got to take a class with the president of the seminary. He was a professor as well, and so he would teach. And the class was called Advanced Greek Exegesis, which is just a fancy way of saying, studying the Greek of the Bible, and how do we interpret it, right? And so the cool thing about it is we actually got to write like a biblical commentary on a specific book. And I loved just a lot of things that my professor talked about in that class. A couple of my quick notes was, one, like we would go really slow over a passage, right? And we spent 2 months on one book. And the reason why we did this is because we would look like verse by this exercise that we were taught was, hey, looking verse by verse and saying, hey, what is this verse like really saying? And then how do all these verses around it fit together as a unit? And I'm not saying you have to do that as you're reading the Bible, but I do think that giving yourself time to read slowly and not in a rushed capacity is very helpful. The other thing I really loved about that class was this emphasis on how does everything fit together. And what I mean by that, I mean like things throughout the Bible, as you're reading in the Bible, how does this part of the Bible fit with a different part of the Bible? And like, because while it is specific, there's this library of books, they're a cohesive unit. There's a reason why they're put together as one thing, as one story. And a few different ways that this might influence how you're reading if something doesn't seem like it fits the character of God, you want to check that, right? So if you're interpreting a passage a certain way and you're like, that doesn't seem to fit in with this other thing that I've heard. Well, look at that, right? Pay attention to that and say, okay, how do I mitigate? How do I fit these things together? So if something is said like very clearly in one passage and then another passage, you have 2 or 3 different ways that the direction might go. Well, once you know that first piece of information, it kind of colors how you're going to filter that other 2 of interpretation, right? So you're looking at a passage and you know that in Galatians, Paul shares that there is no works that can save you. You can't be saved through works. Okay, so no amount of good thing you do can earn your relationship with Jesus. It's all based upon that forgiveness and the death of Jesus on the cross. And so as you're reading a passage, if it seems like, oh, this seems like it might be like something that talks about how, oh, you can earn this or you'll earn salvation. Well, you want to, it's talking about something a little bit different in that situation, right? So how it fits together once you know this one piece changes how you're going to interpret a different piece. And so everything just like fits so one of the things I learned is that things fit together. And so if there's an inconsistency, it means that we're not interpreting it really well. And the other thing about how everything kind of fits together is you get a really big picture of who God is and how big he is, because you're talking about things that happen in the Old Testament and they provide this context for this relationship that happens in the New Testament. And you'll see these predictions that come true. You'll see these promises that God gives that are fulfilled later on, thousands of years later. And you can see how things fit together. Like, oh, Jesus was promised to people as, hey, there's going to be this redemption. You can just see the grand story of the Bible too. And so seeing how things fit together is a really cool way of reflecting on the character of who God is, and just seeing how he has a plan, how he orchestrated this and he knew what was going to happen. And so he took care of business, which I think is really encouraging to me personally. One of the other things that I kind of learned through seminary is, and this is almost based upon the classes that I took, right? So there are certain classes that would be specific part of the Bible focused, specific book of the Bible focused, right? And that's a way that you can read the Bible, right? You take a specific book. So you take one of the Gospels, you take a biography of Jesus, and you look at who this person was, and you read it through, and you see the whole story, right? That's one way that you can read the Bible, and I would encourage anyone to do that, right? That's a great way to read and interact with the Bible and see the whole picture, see the whole context. It kind of lets you do that. In fact, honestly, you may get a lot out of like a second reading. So like reading it through, understanding the whole book, and then going through and picking out specific parts as you're reading that kind of, once you have a full picture of it, kind of illustrate a little bit more and can give you a better interpretation of what's happening. But we would also have classes that weren't book by book, that they would be topical, right? So you'd have a specific topic, right? So I had a class on, stewardship, right? So how do we utilize the things that God has given us well? God holds us accountable for the gifts and the talents and the things that he's given us. And he says, hey, if you've given this, I expect you to use it and use it well. And so we would look at parts of the Bible that would illustrate those principles. And so there's a couple different ways you can do that. Honestly, YouVersion Bible plans are really helpful for this. And so if you have a specific topic that you're like, I need some more information on this, I would love to dive into this. This is an issue that I'm interested by, or I think I could really grow in. I think that can sometimes be a really impactful moment for you, is saying, hey, this is an area that I know is going to be challenging, but I can really grow in it. Taking a look at what Jesus says about it, taking a look at what the authors of the Bible have written on that topic. And, so that's one way to do it. If you want to go next level, you can do something called a word study. And so, so I'll spread this really quickly. So if you go to like BibleHub.com, you can pull up a Greek word. So like if you have a sentence, like if you know one verse on a certain topic, you can pull up that verse, switch it to Greek, and it'll give you the line by line, like, hey, this is the word you're talking about. And you click on that word, and it'll give you like every occurrence that word has. And so if you're looking up like hope, or you're looking up money, or you're looking up anxiety, something like that, you can find that specific word and all the uses of that topic, and then read those verses. It's like, okay, there's this passage, and this passage. And you can see even in some ways how the word is, you see same words used, but it's interpreted a little bit differently in a context. I would not recommend this to do like just like casually. I would say, hey, like if you really want that next level thing, this is a cool thing that you can do. And I think ultimately, like when I reflect upon my time, just like in seminary, when it comes to like interacting with the Bible and reading the Bible, you do get what you put into it. You know, I wish I could say like, hey, if you don't, you can just like read the verse of the day and it'll make this meaningful impact. I think it's powerful. I think that anytime the Bible is open, anytime the words of the Bible are said, I think that there is power in that, and God will use that. But the more you invest into it, the more rich it becomes. The more meaning that you're going to be able to pull out of it, the more purpose that you're going to be able to pull out of it, because as you'll see things that you never saw before. You'll get a richness you didn't see before, and you'll start to notice. And this is one of the things that I noticed, is that you start to notice that you desire more of that. And the pitfall can be just wanting the knowledge. But the cool thing is constantly reminding yourself and being able to remind yourself, hey, how does this change how I view God? How do I apply this thing to make it matter? Because I think the temptation with any type of, if you get into like reading the Bible deeply, is getting that knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And really, it's about how it affects your relationship with God, and how it affects your relationship with others, and how you experience the blessings of God based on that. And when we do that in a way that is like really intentional and purposeful, and we're like, okay, I want to gain this information so that I can live a life that looks more like Jesus, to love people better like Jesus. That's when you're going to see the Bible really come alive in an amazing way, because God is really going to be with you as you're doing that, because he knows that he's always with you. But I believe that, as you have that heart, God is going to bless that. Well, I could probably go on and on and on about this, as you can tell, but I think I'll leave it there. I think there's a lot of really good, a lot of stuff in there that you can start to apply right away. Real quick summary from that would just be that, you can go slow. Understanding the context is so big. And so if you're like struggling to get plugged in or invested into a piece of the Bible, understand a little bit more of the story. I like to describe, I love baseball, and one of the ways I try to make it more interesting for people that are watching with me that don't actually like the sport is I'll describe the story of the people involved, right? So, oh yeah, this hitter, he's really good friends with this person, and he was traded, and this is about his family. And I'll share those things because it adds color and it adds meaning to these players and these people. And I think when we understand more of the context of a Bible passage, you understand the person that is going through it and what's happening to them a little bit better. It really brings out more meaning. So I'd encourage you to gain some context knowledge. So yeah, context is so big. And then, being able to switch things up between going book by book and going topical when there's something that you really want to dive into is a really cool and powerful tool in the tool belt. And so give that a try if you're looking to mix it up, or in fact, if you haven't done this, let me just give you one step to do. Set the Ridge as your church on the YouVersion Bible App. So if you don't have the YouVersion Bible App, I highly recommend it. It's just got so many useful tools and the ability to have the Bible on the go on your phone. Lots of great plans. And so if you have that, or if you're just downloading it, if you click on Discover and then you type the Ridge Community Church and hit go, you'll see the Ridge's icon and the orange one, and just click on that, set it as your church, and you'll be able to see our featured plan as we're going through it. And so that's going to follow the series that we're doing, or if it's something that we really want to highlight. It's a great way to get a good plan and lets you connect with us. So go ahead and do that, and know that it's a great resource and a great way to stay connected. Yeah, thanks for listening to me reflect on some of the seminary stuff. And I hope that if you enjoyed this podcast, that you'll subscribe or follow and give us a like, and honestly, maybe a rate and a review as well, because those reviews really do matter and they really do affect who sees us in the podcast listings. And so we want more people to be able to experience the hopeful and helpful conversations and things that we have. And so please do that. And thanks for listening to the Ridge Podcast.